My name is Ken Connolly, and I want to tell you a story. It's a story about a preacher, but it's a preacher that many people believe was the greatest preacher that lived since the days of the Apostle Paul. It was in 1853 when he was a 19-year-old boy and he first came to this city of London. In fact, he turned this city upside down. He had celebrities of every description that you can imagine coming to hear him preach. And he spent his entire ministry in this area preaching, and the effect that he had upon the English-speaking world is literally staggering beyond belief. I'm talking about the man they called the Prince of Preachers. His name was Charles Haddon Spurgeon. Behind me is the London of the 1990s. That's Big Ben at the bottom of the street, and the street is Whitehall. But we're not interested in the 1990s. We're interested in the 1800s. We want to know what it was like when Charles Spurgeon came here. How can we judge the actions and reactions of the man without knowing the context in which they were made? What was it like to live then? London was in a mess. To be honest with you, it had problems. Or the Industrial Revolution had occurred, and by the 1850s they were doubling their export every 10 years. But they left a backlash behind them. London had become a city of 2 to 3 million people, and it's almost impossible to visualize their living conditions. The Thames was but a rotten garbage dump, and streets were literally ankle deep in horse dung. An unbelievable spawn of homeless children roamed the streets, and petty crime seemed to be the only way that they could survive. Those were the crises and conflicts that represented the backdrop. Now, Charles Haddon Spurgeon is going to walk on stage. Though Spurgeon spent the last 40 years of his ministry in the city of London, he spent the first 19 years in the county of Essex and Cambridgeshire, here northeast of London. The particular village from which Spurgeon came is where I'm standing at the moment in Kelvedon. It's built on a road that was once built by the Romans themselves when they came to Britain. The date was the 19th of June, 1834. John and Eliza Spurgeon lived in a little cottage behind me. Eliza was only 19 years of age when Charles came into the world, and he was the first of 17 children. The majority of them died in their infancy. Spurgeon was only a child of about 14 months when he came to this English countryside village of Stambourne. His parents had moved to Colchester, his dad becoming a clerk in a coal merchant's office, and then becoming the pastor of a church at Tollesbury. It was about 9 miles away from Colchester. It's really impossible to tell the effect that this countryside had upon him. Let me give you an illustration. They were sitting at the table, and Granddad, being the pastor of the church, had a burdened heart for one of his straying members. His name was Thomas Rhodes, and he was down at the local pub drinking with other people, and it broke his Granddad's heart. Little Charles was only 5 years old at the time, but he got up from the table and excused himself and went down until he found that pub. He opened up the doors of it, and when everybody looked and saw a 5-year-old boy walking into the place, they immediately became silent. In Charles's inimicable way, he asked, "Where is Thomas Rhodes?" Nobody needed to tell him because everybody looked at the man. He went over to him and he said to him, "Elijah, I am ashamed of you sitting with the ungodly. You are breaking your pastor's heart. I want you to know I would never break my pastor's heart." I mention that only to let you know that's the kind of influence his granddad had upon his life. And where I am standing at the moment is by the grave where his granddad and his grandmother are buried together. When you look at the top of it, the weather has worn away the letters so that it's difficult to detect who is in this grave. But there is no question about it. No weather could wear away the influence that that man had on this boy's heart. He was his model. He was his hero. He affected him for the rest of his life. I'm in the city of Colchester. The date is January 6, 1850. The Spurgeon family lived over here on Hythe Hill, which is an adjacent street. It was snowing very heavily that morning. The father decided to go to church and minister to his flock without bringing the 15-year-old boy with him. The mother instructed the boy to go to a local congregational church. But when he got to the end of the street, this being Artillery Street, the snow came down so heavily, he decided, knowing that there was a local church here, that he would come down to this local church. It was then, in the providence of God, that he walked into this primitive Methodist church, and it was here that he had the most important experience of his life. This is the place of his conversion. Because of the inclemency of the weather, only 15 people turned up for the service that morning, and among those who were missing was none other than the minister himself. That meant that a layman was going to have to preach the sermon. Spurgeon came over to this approximate location, and he sat down, and he couldn't even lift his eyes to look at the preacher. He recorded the event that happened here 280 times during his life. And in his own words, he put it like this: "My life was full of sorrow and wretchedness, believing that I was lost." And then he heard the preacher quoting Isaiah 45:22. "Look unto me, and be ye saved, all the ends of the earth." He had not much else to say, thank God, for that compelled him to keep repeating his text. And there was nothing needed more by me at any rate. He pointed to where I was sitting under the gallery, and he said, "That young man looks very miserable." And he shouted, as I think only a primitive Methodist can, "Look, look, young man, look now." I saw what a Savior Christ was. And as soon as the snow fell on my road home from the little house of prayer, I thought every snowflake talked to me and told me of the pardon that I had found, for I was white as the driven snow through the grace of God. Before I leave this place, I need to say a word about the importance of the event that happened here. It was Spurgeon's conversion. That was his life-transforming experience. I doubt that anything else ever happened in his life that can compare to the experience that he had sitting in this seat. It was here that a guilty sinner met a pardoning God. It was here that he became a bond slave to Christ. He decided, I'm sure, while he was sitting here and the experience of the forgiveness of sin flooded his soul, that whatever Christ wanted in his life, Christ could have. That's not simply true of Spurgeon. That's true of anybody that ever meets Christ. But it was going to prove to be a very significant event for him. That night, his mother brought him to a Baptist church. And that led to the next great experience in his spiritual pilgrimage. I'm standing here in the River Lark, and I think it's for an obvious reason. But I don't know if it's as obvious as to why Charles Haddon Spurgeon was standing here. You see, his parents and his grandparents were Congregationalists, and they believed in infant baptism. The question is, what was it that brought Charles Haddon Spurgeon to be baptized as a believer by immersion in these waters? The answer is that when he was 14 years of age, he went to an agricultural college to train to be a teacher. He was living in the house with his uncle, who was the principal of that college. On one occasion, an Anglican minister came and spoke to them on various subjects of religion, bringing up the topic of baptism. And that was the first time that Charles publicly voiced an opinion different to that of his parents and his grandparents. He wrote to a minister by the name of W. Cantlow, and he asked him as a Baptist minister, would he do Spurgeon the favor of baptizing him publicly? When Cantlow agreed to it, then Spurgeon wrote home to his dad, and he asked him if he would give permission. His dad didn't want to impede his spiritual progress, and so he consented to let him do it. The day for the baptism was May the 3rd, 1850. He was only a 15-year-old boy at the time, and it happened that he had to walk 8 miles from Newmarket to this place in order to be baptized. There was a ferry that crossed the river at that time, and there were people standing on the ferry to witness the baptism. Incidentally, they were standing on the bank across the river. They were on the bank on this side of the river, and there were small boats in the middle of the river that were all there just to witness, not just C.H. Spurgeon, but a baptism. His baptism was the first believer's baptism that he had ever seen. Oh, he was eloquent about the experience at a later date. He said he didn't care if all heaven and all earth and all hell were witnessing. He was proud to be associated with the Lord Jesus Christ and to follow him in the act of obedience. He said that when he was in this water, it washed away his fears. It did more than that. It loosed his tongue. And only those who know the eloquence of the man who spoke those words can testify it must have had a profound effect upon him. That's the significance of the River Lark. He was no less fascinated by the thrill of being converted to Christ. Every week he would go to 70-some homes, and he would declare to them what the Lord Jesus Christ had done for him and what he was able to do for them. And then Charles decided that he was going to join a church. It was that brought him into this church, the St. Andrew's Baptist Church of Cambridge. And not long after he came into the church, he was given the position of a teacher in the Sunday school of young boys and girls, and he proved to be proficient at it. In the church, there's a man by the name of Mr. James Vinter. Can I say that every church needs a James Vinter? He was a man of vision, a man of passion, a man that carried a great burden for his community. And he knew about 17 different hamlets around the Cambridge area that didn't have a sound evangelical witness in them. And on Sunday night, the people of those little hamlets would go nowhere to church. He decided that he would find a supply of preachers who could go to these churches and witness to these people. It was that encouraged him to get young men with potential to undertake an assignment and go to such a place. But he knew that Charles wouldn't go. He knew that Charles didn't judge his talents that well. And so he tricked him. Well, I don't want to say that he tricked him. What I'd really like to do is just tell you the story and let you decide, was it right or was it wrong? I don't know. What he did, he came to Charles one day and he said that there's a little hamlet of Teversham and they have no way of having a service unless somebody goes there. I have a young man that is going there, and I wonder, because it's a very difficult task for one person to do alone, would you be kind enough to go with him and just be supportive of him in prayer? Charles agreed. He met the young man at the church that afternoon, and they walked the 4 miles that took them to Teversham. When they were on the way there, the young man in the company of Charles was very quiet. And Charles interpreted that to mean that he's meditating upon his subject. He didn't realize what the problem was. When he explained to the young man before they got to the cottage that he would be praying for him, the young man asked him why. And he said, well, because you're going to be preaching and I want to support you in prayer. The young man said, I'm not going to be preaching. I'm only here to pray for you. It was then that they discovered that they had been tricked. Now what are they going to do? Well, the young man said to Charles, you teach a Sunday school class. You've got something that you could teach them. And so Charles decided that he would preach. And he took for a text, unto them that believe he is precious. And he declared his first oration for Christ in that little thatched roof cottage. At the end of the sermon, an elderly lady stood up and said to him, "Young man, that was wonderful. How old are you?" And he responded, "Sit down, madam. You're not allowed to ask questions till the service is over." They still had one hymn to sing. When the hymn was finished, she stood up again, and she said, "Young man, how old are you?" And his reply to that was, "I'm under 60. He was, in fact, only 16 years of age. For 1 year, Spurgeon preached in thatched roof cottages and in churches around Cambridgeshire. And then he was invited to this little village of Waterbeach to preach at the local Baptist church on a Sunday morning. That is the church behind me. It was the year 1851. It was the month of October. He was only 17 years of age. They were so deeply impressed with him that they invited him to come back the following Sunday. And the following Sunday, they were more impressed with him. They invited him to become the pastor of this church. He literally turned this village upside down. I mean, the most notorious drunkards were being converted. The little thatched roof building that was behind me at that time was packed from wall to wall, and they had to keep the windows open in order that the people that couldn't get into the building would be able to hear him. When Spurgeon became a world-famous preacher, he came back to this little village of Waterbeach, and on several occasions he preached at this church. In fact, this church, which has been built since the days of his pastorate, he laid the cornerstone of it. It soon became obvious that the boy preacher of Waterbeach would not be there for long. But nobody ever dreamed that when he left, he would take as big a giant step as he did take. That brought him right here to Park Street in the heart of London, right by the River Thames, where on one side of the church he's under the shadow of the Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, and on the other side of the Thames, St. Paul's Cathedral immediately across the river from him. And the pulpit that he came to was the most prestigious pulpit that he could have found, because the names that were associated with it were names like Benjamin Keach, who wrote Tropologia, or A Key to Scripture Metaphor, followed by a man named John Gill, who wrote The Body of Divinity. And nearly every theological student has The Body of Divinity in his library. And he was followed by a man named John Rippon, and John Rippon was the pastor of this church for 63 years and had only recently left it. When I mention names like that associated with the pulpit, I have to say that side by side with that, it's a strange enigma that he would have a church that's so close to the River Thames. Whenever this river would overflow its banks, it would wet the floors of his chapel. And when it receded, it would leave barges stuck in the mud. And it was Spurgeon that said that those barges in the mud reminded him of the church that he was in. The morning that Spurgeon came here to try out for the pulpit of the new Park Street Chapel, there were only 80 people that came. 5 of them voted against giving him a call, and the rest gave him a call with conditions. The conditions were that it would be renewed or reviewed within 6 months. He declined that and said only 3 months, because he didn't want to pastor them for 3 months unnecessarily if they didn't want to have him. They soon found out that all of their fears were ungrounded, because 400 people came to hear him that night. And soon the 1,200-seat auditorium was filled to its capacity and overloaded. Shortly it became evident they were going to have to enlarge the building, and to do that they had to move out of it, and they went to the Exeter Hall. The Exeter Hall could seat 4,000. They filled that, and sometimes there were as many people turned away as were able to get inside the hall. Because of the popularity that Spurgeon had as a preacher, they declined to renew his contract at the Exeter Hall. So he decided to move to another location. He went to the Surrey Garden Music Hall. And it was at the Surrey Garden Music Hall where the greatest calamity of his ministry happened. His first service was slated for Sunday night, October 19, 1856. There was an estimated audience of 20,000. It was in the middle of the opening prayer that someone from the gallery deliberately and falsely shouted fire. Another from another area shouted, "The galleries are falling." And still a third shouted, "The whole place is collapsing." There was in fact no fire, but a panic resulted in which 7 people were killed, 28 others taken to the hospital, and many others severely wounded. The tragedy was so great and affected Spurgeon so deeply that people believed he would never get into a pulpit again. But again they were wrong, because it was 2 weeks later that he was back preaching in the same place, and his popularity grew. At a later time in his ministry, when he needed to get out of the church and find another building where he could meet people, he went to the agricultural hall. It was able to seat 15,000 with 2,000 to 3,000 standing. But when we talk about the people that came to hear Spurgeon preach, this is the place where he spoke to the largest audience of all. These are the remnants of the Crystal Palace, one of the magnificent buildings of the Victorian age made out of glass. It was a Wednesday night, October the 7th in 1857, and 23,654 people came to listen to him in this building. Imagine that. 23,500 people. It must have been a magnificent voice that he had. And it must have been a powerful attraction that he had as a preacher, because he drew that many people from around London so that they would come to this vicinity, and in this location they would listen to him preach. It is estimated that Spurgeon preached the message of a crucified Christ to as many as 10 million people in his lifetime, before any radios came into existence or any television sets. There's no question. He was a powerful attraction in his generation. He was the talk of all London, but I'm afraid that the idol had feet of clay. An American came by to a service one day, and the American wanted to give a word of salutation, and the salutation was that God had given him victory over the habit of tobacco. Well, when Spurgeon heard that, he got up and addressed the audience, and he told the audience that he was going home that night to enjoy a good cigar to the glory of God. However, it ought to be mentioned that when he saw the advertising associating his name with the brand of cigars he was smoking, he then decided that he would no longer continue the habit. And while I speak about the man, I ought to make mention to his mental powers, because there's no way that you can estimate the value of this man without knowing the ability that he had in the process of thought. It was stated by him that on one occasion he had 8 separate channels of thought that were going through his mind at the same time while he was preaching. He was unquestionably a brilliant man. When you're making an evaluation of a man, surely you have to take into consideration the company he keeps. And Spurgeon kept notable company. In fact, in his generation, it would read like Who's Who. Include, for example, men like W.E. Gladstone, who for 4 times was the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And on more than one occasion, Spurgeon would be at 10 Downing Street to have breakfast. And remember that in his audience, frequently, there would be various members of the royal family. Included in his friends would be the name of David Livingstone, the great explorer, missionaries like Hudson Taylor, humanitarians like George Mueller of the Bristol Orphanage, and then William Booth of the Salvation Army. That list of friends is surely indicative of the influence that C.H. Spurgeon had on his generation, not only in England, but in the far-reaching areas of the English-speaking world. Spurgeon was a preacher. First and foremost, Spurgeon was a preacher. Everybody that knew him for his preaching, though he deserves credit for many other things that he accomplished in his life, and we applaud what he did. He would be very disappointed if we did not represent him first and foremost as a preacher. Behind me is the Metropolitan Tabernacle. It was built to accommodate the crowds that were coming to listen to him preach. It was possible to get 7,000 people in that auditorium, and on occasions he had to ask his congregation to vacate the building so that people on the outside could come in, And as quickly as they vacated it, it was filled up again with another 7,000 people. That means that in the area here, there were some 7,000 people that couldn't get into the building at least. And they were able to get a chance in there to hear him preach, because he wanted them to hear the gospel that he had to preach. I've got to say a word to you about Spurgeon as a preacher. First of all, I would be negligent of my responsibility if I didn't introduce you to his theology. I'm not here to criticize him. I'm not here to defend him. I'm simply here to report. Spurgeon was a Calvinist. Spurgeon believed in the sovereignty of God. It is impossible for you to read the works that Spurgeon has written without coming to the conclusion that he was an avid disciple of the concept that God was a sovereign, powerful being, and that God initiated those acts that brought men to himself. That did not deter the fact that he believed that man was personally accountable. He believed that man was accountable to God for what he did with the decisions that were before him. And for that reason, he preached with passion. He preached with power. Every single time that he got into the pulpit, as he put it himself, he said, I announce a text, and then I make a beeline for the cross. He said that when you come to the gates of the celestial city, you will notice written above the gates, whosoever will, let him come. But if you'll take one step on the inside, look back over your shoulder, you'll notice that on the other side of that writing, it records elect according to the foreknowledge of God. He was a sovereign grace preacher, and at the same time, he made man accountable for his decisions. I'd like to tell you something about the way with which he delivered his message, because he was an orator. But to do that, let me go inside. This is the tabernacle of Spurgeon's day, and this is the pulpit from which he preached to as many as 6,000 people comfortably seated, but generally 7,000 people present. And I brought you here because you notice there are no microphones. There's no amplifiers. It's a day before these things were invented, and he had to reach this vast audience that packed into this auditorium with his human voice. When he was teaching his own students that they ought to use their voice, he explained to them that when somebody is sitting in the back row, they ought to be able to hear you whisper. And they said, Mr. Spurgeon, could you demonstrate that for us? He said, I will. And he brought them over here to the tabernacle, and he asked them to go back up into the very far part of that upper balcony and stand back there. And he whispered to them, gentlemen, if you can hear my voice, I want you to take out a handkerchief and wave it at me. And every student stood up, and every one of them took out his handkerchief and waved it back to Mr. Spurgeon. Then, in his own inimicable way, he simply leaned back, filled his lungs with oxygen, and he shouted at those gentlemen, gentlemen, put away your handkerchiefs, they are dirty. Nobody ever came to this tabernacle to hear Spurgeon, but they were amazed at the magnificence of his voice. Joseph Parker is a good illustration. He was the minister of a large congregation on the other side of London and an exceptional orator himself, but he said, it was the mightiest voice I ever heard. He could have given orders in the midst of a tempest. Another man that heard him, by the name of Thomas, said, it was varied in its tones, so full of compassion that it was in itself a whole orchestra. One of his biographers said that he roared like the ocean breakers, and he could coo like a dove. And another said, I have called it a trumpet, and better still a bell. Its tones roll on. There is no exhaustion. There is just no way to describe the magnificence of this man's voice. When I was a 20-year-old student here in the city of London, I had an 84-year-old professor by the name of E.J. Poole Connor, who had the opportunity in his early days of listening to Mr. Spurgeon in this tabernacle. He sat back here on the 9th row, and he said, I learned the secret of how he was able to speak so many times in so many conditions, and yet his voice never tired. He simply raised it 2 tones. whatever you say about the man, you can never give a just appraisal of him until you've said something about his voice. Another remarkable feature of Mr. Spurgeon's ministry was in the field of education. And I think it's remarkable for two reasons. In the first place, consider his own education. He learned how to read, and he became more proficient at that art than probably many people that went to the university. But he only spent 1 year in an agricultural college learning to be an assistant to a teacher. And yet, he involved himself in training other people for the ministry. I'm standing in front of a present-day Spurgeon's College in South London. But to find out where this college came from and how it all began, I need to refer you to Mr. J.J. Brown. He was a student at the school. He later became the chairman of the committee and then served as secretary of the college. And he had this to say about the way the school began.
When the Metropolitan Tabernacle was built, the classes were held in the basement of the Tabernacle, and the number of students gradually increased until in the 1870s something like 100 students were being taught. By the end of Spurgeon's life, there were probably 900 students who had been prepared for the Christian ministry at home and overseas. He had set up this college to encourage preachers. The academic standard may not have been very high at that time, but he recognized the value of a good education, particularly as there was educational development in the country at this time.
The school was really unique in three different ways. In the first place, Mr. Spurgeon did something that was against the trend of his day. He set up the authority of the school within the school. He became affectionately known as the governor of it. They decided that instead of having other institutions put an approval upon them, they would give their own examinations and they would determine their own standards. The second major thing that he did that was different, it didn't cost the student to come to the school. Not only did it not cost him to come, but he was given 15 shillings every week so that he could take care of his own personal needs. And when it came time for him to graduate, 2 years later, he was usually given a small stack of books by Mr. Spurgeon to help him get his library started. The third area where it was different is in what they determined the school would stand for. In the field of theology, they accepted a Calvinistic view of the atonement. They believed in the utter infallibility and authority of the Word of God, and they believed in the doctrine of eternal punishment. And they decided on these issues they would not yield ground. And Spurgeon then became an educator. And this is the result, still continuing in the 1990s, 100 years after Spurgeon's death. I'm standing in the college library of Mr. Spurgeon, which looks exactly as it did when he walked into the room in his day. There are 12,000 books. He loved them. He paid a great deal of attention to books, and he wanted other people to do the same thing. When he first became interested in Miss Sadie Thompson, in order to let her know that he had affections toward her, he gave her a book. It was Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. He first started printing when he was at Waterbeach, and he printed what he called the Waterbeach Tracts. And then 4 years later, Mr. Joseph Passmore came to him and said, "Mr. Spurgeon, have you ever considered how you can enlarge your ministry if you would just put your sermons into print?" And he convinced him that he ought to publish a penny pulpit. And that penny pulpit eventually became the 63 volumes that span over 25 years and bring 5,361 sermons to public attention. And they went everywhere all over the world. They were translated into other languages. A woman was buying a pound of butter in the city of London and found out when she got home it was wrapped up in one of Spurgeon's sermons, and she read and was converted on the reading of that sermon. There were 3 titles that Mr. Spurgeon published that sold over 1 million copies. One of them was entitled All of Grace, and when Moody Press opened up in this country, The first book that it brought up its printing press was All of Grace. There were titles, for example, that went all the way down, if that's the right designation, to John Plowman's Pictures. And those pictures were a farmer philosophizing about drunkenness and about debts. And then there was The Treasury of David, which took 20 years for him to compile and were brought in 7 different volumes and sold over 148,000 copies while he was living. When you talk about the writing of Charles Spurgeon, you have to include in it The Sword and the Trowel, the magazine that he put out in which he gave those personal expressions of himself and by which his heartbeat became known to the public of his generation. And then on top of that, there are those letters that he wrote. Because would you believe it, that man wrote 500 letters every week, and they went to various parts of the world. When the man is remembered, by what is he remembered? There were a few thousand people at his death that knew him as a preacher. There were hundreds of thousands in various continents, in various languages, that knew him primarily as an author. It's true to say no single minister in history has ever produced from the prolific pen that was used by Charles Haddon Spurgeon. Mr. Spurgeon was also a philanthropist. Back in 1898, the tabernacle went on fire, and that was just 6 years after the death of Spurgeon. They found out later that the fire began in the chimney of the kitchen, and no wonder. It happens to be that the tabernacle was open from 7 in the morning till 11 at night, 7 days a week, usually served 3 meals every day. On special occasions, such as when the Christian Butcher Association held their annual meetings at the tabernacle, they served 1,600 people at one time for 1 meal. And that's not bringing into consideration the 1,000 boys and girls that met there on a Sunday afternoon and the 100 teachers that trained them in the Sunday school. There was one lady by the name of Mrs. Lavinia Bartlett who was given a class of 3 girls. She built that class to 500. On special days, there were 700. In 1875, when Mrs. Bartlett passed away, there were 1,000 people that paid tribute to her as having led them to Christ. She was an amazing woman and a great assistance to Dr. Spurgeon. Then there were the other different associations and societies that met. There was the Evangelist Association. There was the Gospel Temperance Association. There was the Blind Association. There was the Flower Association. That was a group of people that met together and they arranged flowers in baskets and they brought them to the homes of sick people and they brought them to the hospitals. Then there was the Ladies' Benevolent Society. That's a group of people that met, and in the tabernacle they would sew clothes for those poor children and other poor families that were in need of it. There were many different associations. In fact, on the 25th anniversary of Spurgeon, it was considered that there were 66 separate associations that were meeting in the tabernacle. But then there were associations that met out of the tabernacle. Behind me is the famous Wycliffe tree. It is called that because in the 1300s, John Wycliffe preached under the branches of it. And because he did, a man by the name of George Whitefield preached under its branches. And George Whitefield, living in the 1700s, was the mentor of Charles Spurgeon. And because he preached here, so did Charles Spurgeon. You see, these ministries that came from the tabernacle into the greater London area, where some 4 million people lived, there were 40 different missions going on at one time. Over a period of his life, as you've already heard, he built over 200 churches. One of those churches is approximate to this tree. And because it was too small to accommodate the crowd, Charles Spurgeon came out here and he preached also under the branches of this tree. You remember that the Industrial Revolution had left a spawn of street urchins in all the major metropolitan areas, and Christians became vitally concerned about them and tried to do something about them. It was Mr. Spurgeon's burden that he would be involved in something like that. He prayed very earnestly about it when a lady by the name of Mrs. Hilliard sent him a letter and promised him for a project such as that she would donate £20,000. Mr. Spurgeon immediately decided to do something about it. He, with one of his deacons, got in his carriage and went over to see her. But the area that she lived in belied that she had that much money, and he was sure that she had made a mistake. When she came to the door, he thanked her for the £200 that she had donated. "Oh," she said, "did I say £200? I meant to say £20,000. It proved to be by that £20,000 that Mr. Spurgeon was able to buy 2.5 acres of ground on which to build his orphanage. I'm standing on those 2.5 acres right now. It's now a school. But Mr. Spurgeon's mark is still around here, and you can see stones that are engraved to remember that he was the one that started the ministry. He built large houses, a row of them on one side to accommodate the boys, on the other side to accommodate the girls, a playing field between them. At one end of them there was the dining hall, and at the other end a very special feature for an orphanage. And this was it. This pool was actually built by Mr. Spurgeon for a recreational area for the boys and girls that were at his orphanage. He wanted to be sure that whatever it was they needed, they had. There was 1,576 orphans that came through this institution, and he knew every one of them by name. And frequently when he passed by here, because it lay right between the church and his home, he would stop here and would never do it unless he had pockets full of pennies, because he would sit around and talk with the young people, and before he left them he would give each of them a penny, and that was a considerable amount of money in that day. There is no question about it. This institution was a visualization of the heart of Charles Haddon Spurgeon. It is impossible to get an accurate picture of Charles Spurgeon without considering his involvement in politics. And in order to understand that, I have to give you a little bit of background as to the politics of his day. Let me say a word about the domestic issues that made Spurgeon become an involved politician. The first of these goes back to the 1850s. It was the question of the state control of education. Then in the 1860s, the nonconformists took the position that only the church would have a right to give religious education. And they found out by the 1870s that they were going to have to defend the issue of the Bible being kept in the state schools. That's why in 1870 Spurgeon led a protest rally himself, demanding that the Bible is maintained within the state schools. And I cannot think that it's right to say I understand the thinking of this man without analyzing these political issues. I am at the moment in the study that was used by Mr. Spurgeon. It's in this very sacred place to him that he found the material from which he preached every Sunday to people. And many very different thoughts were brought to his heart and his mind while he was in this room. But I don't think that anything became more painful to him, or those thoughts that passed through his mind, than that which related to the downgrade controversy. You remember when Paul was speaking to the Ephesian elders in Acts chapter 20, he told them that they would have trouble from without and trouble from within. And Mr. Spurgeon experienced the trouble that comes from within. It was in the month of March in 1887 that a man named Robert Schindler gave an article to the Sword in the Trowel, and he called it The Downgrade. He was warning against people that minister the gospel and yet do not accept the deity of the Lord Jesus Christ. And it caused quite a commotion. Mr. Spurgeon simply decided that he would enlarge on it, and he made reference to ministers of whom he apparently had knowledge, who denied the infallibility of the Scriptures. They denied the substitutionary death of Christ, and they denied eternal punishment. And by the time that October came that year, and they had the Baptist Union meeting, there was an uproar. And in that uproar, Mr. Spurgeon could see that it was about to divide their fellowship. And in order to avoid that, he simply resigned from the Baptist Union. A tremendous turmoil followed that event, and people came to Mr. Spurgeon and asked him if he would name the culprits. When he declined to do that, they said, "Will you please provide the evidence?" When he declined to do that, they said, "Would you please withdraw the charges?" When he declined to do that, they decided when they met the following January that they wouldn't allow him the comfort of simply withdrawing from the union. They would censure him. By doing that, they were going to put him out of the union. On April the 23rd of that same year, they had their next union assembly. And those people that loved Spurgeon did not want him breaking from the fellowship, and therefore tried to get some statement of faith that would reconcile the two sides together. But the sides were really irreconcilable. Nevertheless, James, Charles Spurgeon's brother, made every effort to try and get them to put down something that could be appealing, or at least, even if they're going to yield some ground, yield ground from both sides. And they came to what he thought would be agreeable. When it was brought before the floor and introduced, it was James Spurgeon, Charles's brother, who stood up and seconded the motion. But it broke Charles's heart. They simply did not understand that on matters that are fundamental and basic in the faith, you cannot yield. And there's no question, that was the greatest and heaviest cross that Spurgeon had to bear. His wife believed until the very end that it was literally that incident that took his life and broke his health. It's called the downgrade controversy. This is the town of Mentone in southern France, the way that it appeared to Spurgeon in the winter of 1871, the first time that he saw it. He'd been in Italy for 6 weeks because Mr. Joseph Passmore and a few friends had taken him there for his health's sake. And on the way back to London, they stopped here. And the moment Mr. Spurgeon saw this place, his comment was, "It is calculated to make a sick man leap with health." The first time that Spurgeon became physically sick was back in 1869. He had just recovered from his sickness when he caught smallpox. And he had not recovered from that when he had his first attack of gout. Gout is an inborn disease that is caused by the retention of uric acids in the body. There are many different reasons that bring on the attack. But when it does come, it brings a temperature of over 103 degrees, and it brings excruciating pain. It was unfortunate in Spurgeon's case that the pain was so severe that he explained on one occasion that he had to lie on his right side for 7 unbroken days. And it always has its own after effects. In his case, it was depression. It was deep, deep depression. He wrote a letter in 1871 in which he made an admission about the depth of his depression. He said that he had conversation with God in which he quoted to him from Psalm 103 verse 13, "As a father pitieth his child, so the Lord pitieth them that fear him." And he mentioned to God that if it were his child, and he knew that he was suffering that kind of pain, he would do anything within his power to give him release. This is the room in the hotel in Mentone, France, with which Mr. Spurgeon became very familiar, because he came here every winter that he had an attack of gout. And it was in this room that he met his friends, and in this room on occasion he would preach to them. In February of 1891, he was able to get back to London, and it was just in time for the annual business meeting. And that in a way must have been an encouragement to him. He found out that there were in good standing 5,328 members, that there was 127 men who were laymen of the church, who were on behalf of the church out preaching every Sunday, that there were 23 mission stations with 4,000 seats, and the gospel was being preached to those people every Sunday. And there were 27 Sunday schools that employed 600 teachers and ministered to 8,000 students. It was June the 7th of that same year that he preached for the last time at the Tabernacle. It was obvious that this was a very serious and severe attack of gout, and the chief rabbi for London asked his congregations to pray for Mr. Spurgeon. And Mr. Spurgeon's name was mentioned, for example, at Westminster Abbey and at St. Paul's Cathedral, requesting prayer on his behalf. And he got letters of sympathy that came from the Prince of Wales. They came from Mr. Gladstone, who had been the Prime Minister of England, and from various members of the Parliament. Although he preached his last sermon at the Tabernacle in June, it was October before he was able to travel back to Mentone here. And it was on the 26th of January when he fell into a coma. And at 5 minutes past 11 on the 31st of January, he left this life. 5 people were present that walked into his room, and together they discovered that he was dead. His wife was among them. They all 5 fell down on their knees around his bed, and she is the one that voiced the prayer. She thanked her God that he had allowed her to live another 3 months with her husband since she had given him up. And somebody present said she had never been in such a moving experience in her life. They couldn't move the body for 2 days in Mentone according to French law. When those 2 days had finished, they then moved the body onto a train, and they started it on a 4-day trip that brought it to London. When it arrived in London, it was Monday, and they took it immediately to the college so they could prepare the tabernacle for the viewing of the body. And on Tuesday, the day that followed, an estimated number of 50,000 people had walked by to see the remains of Charles Spurgeon. On Wednesday morning, they held their first service. The first service was for the members of the tabernacle only. Then at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, they held a service for ministers and for students. Then at 7 o'clock at night, they held another service for workers. You must remember that there were so many people that were involved in ministries at the tabernacle that the number of them could fill up the tabernacle, and for that service they did. And then at 10 o'clock in the evening, they held the 4th service, and that was for the general public. The next day was Thursday, the 11th of February, 1892, and they held their last service that morning. Dr. A.T. Pearson, who had occupied the pulpit at the time Spurgeon passed away, was the closing speaker, and he gave the last sermon related to the death of Spurgeon. Then 8 pallbearers took the body in the casket, and they brought it to the vehicle that would take it to the cemetery. Charles Jr. and his wife led the processional. There were some 65 pair horses and between 200 and 300 private carriages that made a 2-mile-long processional. They went for 5 miles from the church to here. It must have been a moving experience. There were 100,000 people that lined the streets. Every store closed its door, including the pubs. And every time they passed a church, the church pealed the bells. When it came as far as the cemetery, only the next of kin were allowed to come close to the casket. Behind them, barricaded from the rest of the people, were about 1,000 people that held special tickets so that they could get the vantage point that they were given. Then 12,000 people were behind them, and the service was conducted here. Mr. Archibald Brown was the speaker at that service, and when he had finished it, they lowered the body in silence. When the body was lowered, then somebody started singing, "There is a fountain filled with blood." And those 2 verses that were favorite to Spurgeon, "Ere since by faith I saw the stream, thy healing wounds supply, redeeming love has been my theme, and shall be till I die." And there's no question that was true about Charles Spurgeon. It went on to say that when this poor lisping, stammering tongue lies silent in the grave, then in a nobler, sweeter song, I'll sing God's power to save. While they were singing it, he was singing the nobler, sweeter song.